Welcome one and all to the 75th annual Random History Debate. Today's topic, the counterculture movement. Our two debaters will be Julia Moylan and Jamie Moynihan. My name is Elizabeth Stewart, and I will be your moderator for the evening. Yes. Well, Julia will be debating that the counterculture did have an effect, and a positive one. Jamie will be debating that it didn't have much of an effect, and the effect it did have was negative. Please hold your applause until the end of each round. Now we may begin. Each of you, please give your opening statements. You have 5 minutes.
Good evening. I would like to say that the counterculture movement of the 1960s had a profound effect on America as it is today. Through its goals of ending racial segregation, ending the war in Vietnam, ending sexual norms, and creating more equal women's rights, the counterculture movement made America how it is today. Starting with the sexual revolution and the addition of new birth control pills, the counterculture movement started out strong with changing the ideas of society as it was at the time. The first birth control pill, starting in 1960, Enovoid, was more reliable and was controlled by the women, which was unlike anything before, as everything was controlled by the man, and it wasn't safe. It could create infections, and it was very dangerous. With this birth control came an increase in premarital sex, as the youth discovered that there was no longer a stigma behind this premarital sex, as there were no more illegal abortions, or at least less illegal abortions, less shotgun weddings, and less single motherhood, as the birth control kind of took care of all of that. With this premarital sex that changed from 10% in the 20s to 40% in the 60s, and then a rapid increase to 94% in the 90s of people having this premarital sex. More young people were getting jobs, especially women. They were getting more confident in themselves and realized that they didn't have to get married as early, so they started getting jobs. And before the 60s, only a third of women worked, and only out of necessity. But then after the 60s and the 70s, women just flooded the workforces to 2000, where 79% of American mothers work, which was a rapid increase and created a large boost in confidence for women. This also encouraged women to fight for their own rights, as there was a large amount of discrimination in the workplace between women and men. In 1963, the women of the counterculture movement got the Equal Pay Act passed, which outlawed any sexual discrimination in the workplace. This also led into 1966, where the National Organization for Women was founded, which ensured women got the same opportunities as men in jobs, education, and politics. This led to issues being taken on by feminists today, as they modeled themselves after the people of the counterculture movement, as the feminists of earlier times fought for voting, which nobody in this time period can really relate to, as we all have the right to vote. But the pay gap is still an issue, and beauty standards are still an issue, which people in the counterculture movement fought for, so it influenced the feminists of this day and age. Also at this time, many of the youth of the counterculture movement fought for an end to racial segregation and took place in the civil rights movement. The Civil Rights Act was passed in 1964 during the time of the counterculture movement, and in 1967 there was a case of Loving versus Virginia, where laws prohibiting interracial marriage were ruled unconstitutional, which hadn't been in place before. There were laws such as the Cable Act before that, which a citizen was stripped of their citizenship if they married an alien or an immigrant who was ineligible for citizenship. with the new civil rights movement came the addition of new musicians like Jimi Hendrix and Otis Redding at the counterculture music festivals like Woodstock, and this influenced music greatly because jazz and reggae music is used so heavily in hip-hop and the music of today's time period. In addition to the fight to end racial segregation, there was also a fight brewing to provide more gay rights. And so for the first time, openly gay organizations started to protest against homophobic attitudes and discrimination in the 60s. Movies and books started depicting homosexuality different, whereas before it depicted them as isolated predators victimizing straight men. It started to show that it was a community. They weren't as feared anymore as they became more human. It was still a negative depiction, but they no longer had that stigma of being predators. The Stonewall riots and other violent protests really kind of kick-started this as they pushed for equality. So in 1973, after all of these riots, homosexuality was finally removed from the list of mental illnesses. This led to 2003 when the idea of homosexuality was no longer considered illegal. There still wasn't legal marriage, but it wasn't a crime to be gay. And then for the first time, gay pride events started to take place, and it just kind of snowballed from there to where we are now with same-sex marriage being legal. This could have never happened before the 60s, as gay and homosexuality was just seen as such a taboo thing. For these reasons, I believe the counterculture movement had one of the largest effects on America as it is today. Good evening. I would like to say that the counterculture movement of the 1960s did not affect the United States in a positive way. If it affected it at all, it affected it negatively. The main goal of the counterculture movement was to end the war in Vietnam. The counterculture youth wanted peace. This peace was not achieved. Although the Vietnam War did end, there is question about whether or not the protests did actually add to that. As John Mayos points out from the New York Times, the peace candidate, McGovern, lost epically after a good 8 years of the war, so the anti-war feelings were not felt by much of the country. It wasn't until Nixon that the Vietnam War actually ended. And then after the Vietnam War, we had the Iraq War and the war in Afghanistan, so this peace was never fully achieved. Also, one of the major problems with the counterculture movement was the drug epidemic. LSD, amphetamines, and marijuana plagued this era, and they continued to plague the country afterwards. Although there was mention of drugs before the 1960s, and there was use of drugs before the 1960s, it didn't get as much attention as it did in the 60s. In the 60s, Nixon started the war on drugs, and this turned into a huge economic problem for the United States. The war on drugs has cost the United States over $1 trillion, and the United States is in trillions of dollars of debt, and every year more money is poured into the war on drugs. In fact, statistics have shown that $4.1 billion could be saved if the war on drugs did end every year, and that would help enormously with the debt that the country is in. And this war on drugs has shown no progress whatsoever. The prisons still get filled, yet the United States is still number one in illegal drug use. So this war on drugs has not helped in any way. LSD was brought back in the 90s, even though it was eradicated in the 80s and the 70s. I do not believe that the counterculture helped in any way with the country, and if it did, it was negative.
Thank you both. That concludes our opening statements. We will now move on to the rebuttal period. As Jamie did not start the first one, he will now start the second one. You may only rebut what was said in the opening statements. You may not start any new points, or I will have to stop you, and I don't want to do that. So no new points. You may begin.
Thank Thank you. On what my opponent said about the sexual revolution, yes, it is true. There was birth control that was invented and women started to work more. However, a majority of the women who started to work more did still work out of necessity, and it would have occurred anyway. They started to have more independence, so they needed to work more. But if they hadn't, there would have been more children, and there still would have been just as much that they needed to pay for, so they still would have had to work more. Also, birth control. Yes, there was a new birth control pill that was made. However, birth control was in effect beforehand. So the idea that the stigma just erases itself because the birth control is suddenly safer is ludicrous. Then on what my opponent said about the civil rights movement, okay, yes, they wound up succeeding in getting segregation ended. However, there is still racial bias and racism in our country nowadays. There was the shooting in Ferguson, and there is so much police brutality against people of color, and all of this is very much against what the counterculture movement stood for, and if they were fighting for this equality between races, it has not been achieved yet. The same thing with women. The Equal Pay Act, wonderful. I'm so happy that that was passed. However, there is still a pay gap, and women are still fighting for it now. So one of the largest accomplishments of the feminists of the counterculture era didn't actually change all that much. There is still a large pay gap. The same thing with gay rights. I am very happy that gay marriage has been legalized. However, there was going to be a time when gay people decided that they weren't going to stand for the discrimination. It wasn't just the counterculture. And even with all of the gay marriage being legalized and steps forward, there are many steps back. There are still bathroom laws about transgender people, and there is still much discrimination. It has not all disappeared because of the counterculture movement. They may have sparked it, but it hasn't moved far enough. Thank you.
Thank you. To what my opponent said about the anti-war protests not being very real, they pushed for the country to realize that Vietnam was not fair, that Vietnam was ruining the country, and Vietnam did end. And there weren't many wars that were much worse than Vietnam after that. Iraq was much shorter, and so was Afghanistan. So, in a way, the protests did help. To what my opponent said about drugs, yes, drugs were happening in the 60s, and the country was brought to attention about an issue. Drugs were happening before the 60s, and they were hurting people. So this war on drugs is with good intention. It may not have the correct methods, but it was in good intention, and the drug use in the 60s brought attention to this huge issue. Oh, and I forgot to say in the opening statement...
No, stop. That is a new point. We said no new points. You made me stop you. I said I didn't want to stop you. Start again. No new points. No new points. Start again.
Okay, then that is all I have to say.
Alright, that concludes our rebuttal period. If either of you have another rebuttal that you wish to say to something that was said in only the rebuttal period, we will have a second rebuttal period. Do either of you wish for this?
Nothing for me. No, I'm alright.
No? Good. We will now move on to the closing statements. You will have a minute for each. Once you finish your closing statements, the debate is over. Thank you. Go ahead.
In conclusion, the counterculture movement may have had its flaws, like the drugs and the anti-war protests not really doing everything that they wished. Yet, there were good things too. Yes, maybe some of these goals weren't realized fully, but they were large goals. Getting rid of racial discrimination can't happen with one try. It needs to happen over a period of time, and they made a move. We no longer have racial segregation. We're going in the right direction. And in a few years, who knows? In a few decades, who can say? It should be even better than it is now. And this was sparked by the counterculture movement. The same thing with feminism. Yes, there is still a pay gap, but it's so much better than it used to be. There's no longer discrimination, and it's not legal for there to be discrimination in the workplace. Women have to be hired if they are qualified for the job. They can't just be turned away because they're women. So yes, there's a pay gap, but that can also change in a few years, in a few decades. We're still working towards that. And this was all started with the counterculture movement. The same thing with gay rights. We're moving in the right direction. Everything is moving in the right direction. And none of it would have been possible with without the counterculture movement. So the counterculture movement may not have changed everything immediately, but it started the change. It made it so the change was possible. And I think that was very important, and I think that greatly affected the United States. In conclusion, yes, there may have been a couple benefits of the counterculture, like its music, or there were some strides made in some instances. But I think that those strides would have been made anyway. And the main goal of the counterculture movement was peace. And that was not achieved. Wars still happened afterward, and there was question of whether the Vietnam War even was affected by the protests. And the main economic downfall of the country nowadays is its debt, and part of that is from the war on drugs, which was a main effect of the counterculture movement. $1 trillion has been spent on this war on drugs, and no progress has been made, leaving the country in a worse state than when it started. I don't believe that the counterculture really affected the United States positively, as the negatives balance out or overweigh the positives. So I think that the counterculture was not as effective as many people believe.
That concludes this episode of Random History Debates. Thank you for giving me the most fun I have had in my lifetime. Tune in next week.